International conflicts are dominating the agenda at the European Council summit in Brussels. EU leaders have gathered for talks on Israel, Gaza, Ukraine, and the EU's tariff dispute with the United States. Now, many of these leaders were also at yesterday's NATO summit in Brussels, where a historic decision was reached to invest 5% of GDP on defense spending. And they hope that that's going to work in their favor during trade talks with the Trump administration.
The European Council summit comes one day after a meeting of NATO leaders in The Hague, where the allies agreed to a major increase in defense spending. It's a key demand of President Donald Trump, who has long complained the US pays too much for NATO.
We achieved a big result with the 5% increased defense spending, which I think is very important for peace and security in Europe, in Canada and the United States.
EU leaders are hoping that the new defense spending deal will help when it comes to another dispute with the US.
I think the positive atmosphere we had in The Hague in security matters will hopefully also have a positive impact when it comes to trade negotiations.
Leaders from the bloc are discussing with European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen the best strategy to take with the administration in Washington. Whether to keep trying to fight for better terms or strike a deal quickly. In just under 2 weeks, a July 9th deadline set by Donald Trump expires, after which the EU imports could face tariffs of up to 50%.
I support the EU Commission in all its endeavours to get a trade deal with the US quickly. I'd like to get the Mercosur agreement off the ground and to conclude more trade agreements. Europe is facing decisive weeks and months.
When it comes to another issue on the agenda, Ukraine's accession to the EU, the bloc's 27 members are not so united.
If we would integrate Ukraine into the European Union, we would integrate the war. And we would not like to be together in one community with a country who is in war and represent an imminent danger on us.
Hungary is using its veto power to block progress in Ukraine's membership process. It has also joined Slovakia in holding up an 18th sanction package against Russia. Other topics on the agenda in Brussels: the EU's relationship with Israel, the wider situation in the Middle East, as well as migration.
We've got our correspondent Jack Perrick reporting on the summit in Brussels. So, as we've heard, this looming deadline of July 9th for the EU to try to find a deal with Trump before 50% tariffs go into effect. Is there already a plan taking shape here?
I think we will not hear exactly what that plan is, but there certainly will be one formulating. And there's a lot of pressure on the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, to act clearly and decisively. We know that the German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, has been putting a lot of pressure on her. He's concerned about protecting Germany's car industry exporting into the European Union, but into the United States, But he's certainly not the only leader that is worried about these tariffs. Essentially, though, what happens at these summits is we get these communiques that come out, so on the different topics that were mentioned, many of the issues, but we won't get a specific communique on this, and that's because the European Commission and its President, Ursula von der Leyen, is tasked with doing those trade talks herself with this July the 9th deadline looming, but the EU feels that it has a bit of scope at the moment after persuading Donald Trump around. He's had a lot of good energy with the NATO summit, with them agreeing to the 5% target, 5% spending target of GDP on defence, that they feel they might be able to come to a deal with him. Looking, I think, at those sort of specific, clear numbers, I think that's what we'll see the plan of the European Union ahead of that July the 9th deadline.
Now, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, of course, also a big part of talks. But Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban is once again standing in the way of European unity on this issue. How do you think they will try to pressure him?
Yeah, there's a couple of things going on that. The first is the discussions around an 18th package of sanctions on Russia over its war against Ukraine. Now, we don't expect that that is going to be signed off during this summit, actually. It looks like that will have to be moved forward. And that's because a lot of countries, Hungary being the biggest voice, but many countries are starting to feel that, after 18 rounds of sanctions, Russia is continuing to wage the war. They do want to move that over the line. There's a discussion about about changing the cap on the price of Russian energy being imported into the European Union. The plan is to outlaw that entirely and eventually, but at the moment that is complicated for a lot of EU countries like Slovakia, like Hungary, which veto these sanctions packages because they are landlocked countries and are very reliant on Russian energy. There are some big discussions about this, and there's still a lack of unity. We've seen the communique come out that is specifically on the topic of Ukraine. It does talk about Ukraine's process into becoming an EU member state, sort of eventually in the future, but not much, it seems, has changed during this summit so far.
And Jack, on Israel and the war in Gaza, European leaders are also struggling to speak with one voice. Stay with us. I just want to hear some remarks first from the Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez.
If I may, to be brief, focus on one issue, which is the report presented to the Ministers of Foreign Affairs by the Human Rights Rapporteur on the catastrophic situation of genocide taking place in Gaza. Therefore, what I will defend today in the European Council is that Europe must suspend the association agreement with Israel.
Jack, tell us more how this is playing out between EU members, those comments we've just heard from Pedro Sanchez.
Yeah, this is an extremely divisive issue right now. We had a report from the European Union that Pedro Sanchez just mentioned, which said that Israel, by the EU's own findings, is in breach of its human rights obligations under the agreement which underpins trade and diplomacy and the way that the European Union and Israel operate with one another. The war in Gaza is in breach of that article, and that's what Pedro Sanchez is saying. And his argument is that because what he calls a genocide, it's important to say that there's no legal grounding for that. The International Court of Justice is investigating those claims at the moment, but there are some countries in the European Union that claim it, including Spain, that should mean that the association agreement with Israel is suspended. Now, that hasn't happened here at this European Council summit. They've said that they will continue to look into it, continue to investigate what this means and what they should do with it. And a lot of countries, Spain, for instance, and Ireland, are frustrated. Sanchez says that it's a double standard to put sanctions on Russia when the EU isn't acting against Israel due to the situation in Gaza. It's an extremely divisive issue.
Jack, thank you so much for that report. That's Jack Perrick in Brussels.